So over to you, Faisal, to enlighten, provoke, and perhaps even annoy us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Dilip. I'd like to thank Professor Dilip Menon and Professor Karabi Sen for inviting me. I'm only sorry that I couldn't be there in person. As you have just heard, I'm recovering from a rather nasty throat infection, the medications for which and the side effects from the medication disallow me to travel. But it really is a great honor to be asked to deliver the Satadru Sen Memorial Lecture, not only because of the illustrious list of speakers who have come before me, but also because of Satadru Sen's own work, which Dilip has described briefly. I did not have the good fortune of knowing him, but I certainly know the work, and it is extraordinary work, both in its depth and its range. I can think of very few historians, and indeed none who work in my own field, or indeed Satadru's field of South Asian history, who possess that kind of range. And so it's a humbling experience, as well as an honor to deliver this lecture in his memory. And I have chosen my subject very deliberately because it is one that Satadru Sen himself wrote a great deal about. And the essay that Dilip, in fact, mentioned without naming, Fascism Without Fascists, which compares India and Israel, is one I shall return to in my lecture. Now, I should begin then by saying that history and politics, as we know, are twinned. They're twinned because it has become impossible to think about politics without thinking about history. Historical language is political through and through. This has not always been the case, and it might indeed have only become the case from the period of the Enlightenment, where the philosophy of history became a way of predicting the political future by constructing a narrative that moved from the past into the present and into the future. So the Enlightenment, therefore, also constructed or was the site for the construction of new versions of teleology. And this might explain why history, like economics, and to some degree politics, is the only academic discipline with a popular readership. It is one whose books can be found in airport bookstores around the world, not because they are necessarily easily grasped, but because they remain at the forefront of public opinion and popular imagination, precisely because it has become impossible to think about politics without history. Though perhaps not the reverse. You can still think about history without thinking about politics. But this relationship, which whether it dates from the Enlightenment or earlier, is, I want to argue, neither inevitable nor indeed beneficial. In our own day, it has become, I think, quite clearly a dysfunctional relationship. Think, for instance, about the US elections, which now dominate news reportage. It's certainly in the West, and which do so to the shame of their participants, of that election's participants, I should say. On the one hand, you have a political party, the Democrats, accusing their rivals of being fascists in some fashion. And then naturally, on the other, you have the Republicans accusing the Democrats of being communists. It is the worst kind of invocation of history that you can possibly get. And yet it is entirely characteristic of contemporary politics. It marks the war in Ukraine as well as that in Gaza, to which I shall return. But what I'd like to say here very briefly, telegraphically, is that these longue durée narratives ignore the recent past almost entirely. So the resort to history in contemporary politics is one that conceals far more than it reveals. It tends to go back at least to the Cold War and the Second World War, if not beyond, sometimes much beyond, but in a way that is inexact, that is historically trivial, and indeed intellectually or analytically trivial. And it often ends up in a set of references to the historical past, which are merely polemical or to some degree juridical in nature. So even though history is all important in such narratives, there is no real historical development. Whether you're talking about decolonization, often, or you're talking about fascism or communism, these ideas are seen as being static. They were founded at a certain point, and they continue in the same manner. Note how different this is from earlier historical understandings of, say, decolonization. When we used to think about Algeria or Vietnam, we didn't just think about them in terms of yet another iteration in the story of decolonization. We thought of them in terms of transitions and developments and transformations in the longer history of capitalism and the emergence of new forms of revolutionary action and resistance. There were very specific historical narratives connected to these words. And one of the things I'm trying to suggest today is that those specificities have been ironed out of many of these debates. Now, historians have recognized in this a wholesale return to the past, and often, as I said, the longue durée past, by talking almost endlessly about what they call presentism. Now, presentism, of course, has to do with the problem, as they see it, of reading the past through the lenses of the present. So when turning to the past, you're simply turning to the precedents of our present. Note how different this is from Marxist or indeed anti-colonial thought in this past, which often was concerned not with saving the past from the present, but rather saving the present from the past. Think of something like Marx's "The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." So much of anti-colonial and left-wing analysis from the 19th century has been dedicated to repudiating the past, not to reinforcing it. It's been dedicated to evacuating the present of history and opening up a new kind of future. So whether it is Marx or Walter Benjamin, the problem was precisely how to free the present from the past. Today, the present tends to be linked, whether on the right or the left, to historical genealogies that go back often a very long way, but that are also centered on the West, on the history of the West, of Western Europe and North America in particular, but especially Western Europe, as being central to global history. Thus, the invocations of fascism and communism, as well as the Second World War and the Cold War. And I can't help but think that these invocations of the past, of the Western past, or of the past in which the West was victorious, both the Second World War and the Cold War, are ways of recentering the West at the center of global history, at a time when it seems to have been shunted a bit off center. I'll come back to this problem. So what, at the end of the Cold War, we often tended to see as triumphalism in the work of people like Francis Fukuyama's End of History, might in fact signal not triumphalism so much as a failure of the political imagination itself at the end of the Cold War. What we end up with is a story of repetition. Thus, the repeated invocations of another world war, another Cold War, even indeed, and I shall come back to this, another apartheid, another fascism, another communism, another civil war, American Civil War, another English Civil War, another 1848. There's a whole series of repetitions. If you look at best-selling history books, many of them are concerned with this kind of issue, that is to say, of historical repetition. Again, the historical repetition of the West read globally. So what if, rather than triumphalism, the end of the Cold War signaled, as I just said, the failure of the political imagination? Because repetition comes to define so much of post-Cold War thinking. A couple of examples. Habermas, in his wonderful book, The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, writes that modernity, as a way of thinking about a rupture in history, ends up reproducing itself endlessly because it must always already be contemporary to us. It is never simply a historical event in the past. But the idea of rupture, which he says characterizes the entire modern or indeed postmodern period, must endlessly repeat itself. You see this kind of thing happening also in new intellectual movements, especially after the Cold War, but also during them to some degree, which are unwilling or unable to name themselves historically in any new fashion. So we have a whole series of movements that begin with postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism. I myself subscribe to a number of these things. So I'm not saying, I'm not mentioning them out of pure criticism here. But I find it quite interesting that all of these movements deliberately and explicitly refuse to think about the new in historical terms. They must only refer to a past historical event and place themselves in its wake. Now, the debate on presentism, I think, wishes to save the past, at least, from this impasse. But it doesn't concern the present at all. But what I'd like to suggest is that, in a very interesting and perhaps paradoxical way, escaping this past rather than returning to it was crucial precisely to dialectical and indeed teleological visions of history, of the philosophy of history, such as Marxism in the past. Therefore, you had a great deal of attention paid to radical contingency in notions such as uneven and combined development. And you will know that uneven development refers to a situation where you have, for instance, the emergence of capitalist relations of production in societies which still contain or are dominated by feudal and other pre-capitalist forms. And this uneven development sometimes allows for otherwise backward countries in the teleological vision of history proposed by a certain kind of Marxism to jump over that history and assume the mantle of revolutionary leadership even before the more developed countries, which in Marx and Engels' view should have taken on that mantle. So ideas such as uneven development were applied to explain the Russian Revolution as much as the Chinese Revolution afterwards. And it's fascinating, as I said, because at the very heart of what you assume is a perfectly teleological vision of history, you have radical contingency. Now, there are other exits from history which are more radical, and I want to describe 2 or 3 of them in no particular order. Let's begin with the 19th century. Sorel, the famous syndicalist, George Sorel's book, Reflections on Violence, which focuses, as you may recall, on what he calls the myth of the general strike. Now, Sorel asks how it is that historical action becomes possible without any sure knowledge of the future in teleological terms, because he has placed teleological ideas of history aside. And let me quote here. And yet, he says, without leaving the present, without reasoning about this future, which seems forever condemned to escape our reason, we should be unable to act at all. Which is to say, how do we deal with our present? How can we think about our actions in the present, even though we can't really imagine the future, even though we are entirely uncertain about the connection between the past and the future that this present is meant to mediate? The myth, he says, must be judged as a means of acting on the present. Any attempts to discuss how far it can be taken literally as future history is devoid of sense. So what he presents us with, therefore, is the idea of the general strike, which is, of course, a very good leftist idea. But rather than taking it as being a necessary and dialectical emanation, if you will, of history, of the logic of history, he takes it as a myth. If we act as if the general strike meant what it is supposed to, we will produce a kind of future, even though we don't, in fact, know that the general strike bears this kind of historical meaning at all. We are perfectly well aware, he says, that the historians of the future are bound to discover that we labored under many illusions, because they will see behind them a finished world. We, on the other hand, must act, and nobody can tell us today what these historians will know. Nobody can furnish us with the means of modifying our motor images in such a way as to avoid their criticisms. So it's an interesting set of thoughts here. He acts as if he were operating within a teleological account of history, but he calls it mythical, the myth of the general strike in particular. He thinks we need to act as if we were conducting ourselves in this historical mode, and in doing so, we'll produce a kind of future, but it's a future which might have very little to do with the myth under which we ourselves operated. So a somewhat convoluted way of thinking about historical action, perhaps, but one which I think is really interesting, because from the very belly of teleology, he draws out what I'm calling radical contingency. Let me move on to another example. This from what is arguably the last classical revolution of the 20th century. Sorel's movement did not end in revolution, but Khomeini's did in 1979, and with an entirely new kind of revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And Khomeini, in his political testament, which was written after the revolution and published when he died in 1989, dispensed with history altogether as a kind of what Derrida would call a metaphysics of presence, to focus on the role of absence in contingency. So he asks, among the things he does in that testament, is to ask, why did the revolution happen in 1979 rather than at any other point? And as a religious thinker, of course, his answers are religious, but they are very interesting. He says, from their love, attachment, and great faith in the exalted Lord and in Islam and life everlasting, even though they are neither in the auspicious presence of the gracious Prophet, peace be upon him, and his descendants, nor in the presence of the infallible Imams, upon whom be peace, and their motivation is faith and trust in the unseen. So he's speaking about the revolutionaries, and he says, well, why did they do what they did? And his answer is, they did it because of faith and trust in the unseen. But he goes further than this, because that, after all, is a perfectly anodyne thing to say. He says, I claim with courage that the Iranian people and its masses of millions today are better than the people of the Hijaz during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his descendants, and the people of Kufa and Iraq in the time of the Prince of Believers and Hassan bin Ali, upon whom be the peace of God. So in addition to saying that these people, these revolutionaries, acted in the absence of any proof, of any evidence, he goes on to argue that precisely because they acted in the absence of proof and evidence, in the non-presence of their sacred figures, they were better than those Muslims who lived in the time of the Prophet and the Imams, who had them present before them, which of course makes the revolution into an extraordinarily negative act. That it is the absence of the divine, it is the absence of the Imams and the Prophet that made it possible. It is precisely faith and trust in the unseen, as Khomeini describes it. Now, neither Sorel's myth nor Khomeini's faith is part of some tradition of the dead generations, as Marx would describe it. Nor can it be expressed in notions like voluntary servitude or false consciousness, which depend upon the opposition between truth, real history, and opinion, false history. They are in fact negative forms and depend upon both of them, the myth of the general strike and faith and trust in the unseen, on the absence of knowledge, on the absence of truth, on non-presence. So it's not a contrast between what is present and what is absent, what is true and what is false. It has to do with acting in the absence of surety and certainty, and in the absence of a known and familiar teleology or a philosophy of history that tells you where you're going from where you have come. In other words, this is also not part of, say, Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg's argument about spontaneism. Where Luxemburg argues that if you let the Soviets learn how to conduct themselves as the revolution proceeds, they will come up with new ideas. And Lenin criticized her for being a spontaneist, because Lenin, of course, thinks everything needs to be planned out beforehand. So this is not a debate about spontaneism. It's closer, perhaps, to Gandhi, and I'm sure Dilip knew I was going to bring him up, not least because today is Gandhi Jayanti. Today is the anniversary of Gandhi's birth, which is a public holiday in India. It's closer to Gandhi's critique of history in the making of the future, because he thinks that if we try to shape the future through the past, or by thinking of the past, or by projecting the past into the future, by our actions in the present, all we are doing is shutting down the future. That we reduce the possibilities of the future to fewer and fewer ones. And then often we end up with the very thing that we wanted to avoid in the first place. So Gandhi, as is well known, counseled that we should live in the present, that we should not actually consider the past, nor should we sacrifice the present for the past, because life and morality and politics are to be conducted in the present. If we sacrifice the present for the past, we are sacrificing ourselves for a future we cannot, in fact, control, but one we might actually narrow rather than expand. So for Gandhi, then, living non-violently in the present meant that you couldn't predict the future, but what you could do and did, in fact, do is open up the future to more and more virtuous possibilities, given that your actions in the present were non-violent. And those possibilities made the future somewhat unpredictable, but it made it more hopeful as well. Rather than, for instance, thinking that if you don't act in a certain way, you will give rise to fascism or communism. Now, for Gandhi, history also disallows analysis altogether. It disallows analyzing politics because it is so tied up with identity. And and therefore fear and hatred, that it is inseparable from violence. And he traces this violence of history to colonial thinking about difference. We know, for instance, that one example of this colonial thinking of difference had to do precisely with differentiating peoples in terms of between those who are advanced, whom history has carried further along the train of civilization so they can rule others, and others who are backwards, who are not yet sufficiently mature to run their own lives and have their own politics. So for Gandhi, history is hierarchical. It characterizes colonial forms of thought, and it is deeply violent because in his time, it had already become the basis, not just of politics, but of identity itself. So in order to make political thinking possible and thinking itself possible, history had to be avoided altogether, which is why nonviolence, like in its own way, Sorel's myth of the general strike or Khomeini's faith in the unseen, is a negative and non-dialectical idea. That is why it is called non-violence. And Gandhi is fascinated by negative terms like non-cooperation and non-possession. Indeed, he once had an interesting conversation with an atheist whom he asked how he might justify atheism. And the atheist turns to him and says, well, atheism is as negative a concept as nonviolence. You should be the one to understand that better than anyone else. And Gandhi, for once, is left at a loss for words. So nonviolence is not only negative grammatically or syntactically speaking, but for Gandhi, it has no history. It is a possibility that is available everywhere and anywhere. It is available in all action as a possibility. It is therefore non-dialectical. So it's not like nonviolence emerges at a certain point as a historical category, a positive category, in some dialectical teleology. It is always something that is possible, that is held in reserve, that is precisely negative. It's non-historical. If anything, it is ubiquitous, but it has, in Gandhi's view, no history. Now, Gandhi's evasion of history was on full display in his career, both in South Africa, in England, and in India itself. Now, since I'm speaking to an audience, some of which at least is in Johannesburg, you will know that Gandhi's two famous ambulance corps, the ambulance corps that he leads, one in the Second Boer War and the other during the Bambate Rebellion. What's interesting about them, there are many interesting things about them. What is best known and true, of course, is that he leads his ambulance corps in order to achieve, if you will, subject rights for Indians in the British Empire. So these actions are meant to obligate or shame the British into recognizing that Indians require certain kinds of rights. Now notice how this aim, and it may not be a very noble aim in the view of some. What's interesting about it is that it has nothing to do with either of those wars. It is completely separate from the historical language that defined both the Second Boer War and the Bambate Rebellion. The ambulance corps also were meant to serve both sides in these wars without any differentiation. That's another way in which the war and its aims played no role in Gandhi's view of them. But it is perhaps the third and more abortive ambulance corps that Gandhi hoped to lead in France as the First World War began, that is the most interesting. In some ways, it follows upon these South African ventures, because he arrives in London in 1914, just as the First World War begins, and he organizes an ambulance corps for service on the Western Front. Again, it has to do with gaining Indians not the kinds of rights that he thought they should have in South Africa, because they didn't labor under those particular kinds of disabilities in England. But he gives a far more interesting reason among the many reasons that he offers. Gandhi tells us that living as he was in England during the war meant that he was complicit in its violence. How to cancel out that complicity? Well, he says, I can either go to the furthest north of Scotland and live on grass, which I do not have the strength to do, or I can actually go closer to the war and put myself at risk by doing so, leading an Indian ambulance corps that will serve both the British and the French, but the Germans as well, without differentiating between them. And in doing so, he thought that he would be saved from at least the karmic complicity of benefiting from the war. Because living in England and not risking his life as the war was progressing in France was simply, in his view, to be a gainer from violence, because his food supply and his security was guaranteed by the Royal Navy and the Army. So in all of these cases, Gandhi showed himself to be entirely indifferent to war aims, to who would win or lose the war. Indeed, he tells us later in his book Satyagraha in South Africa that he was actually far more approving of the Boers during the Boer War than he was of the English. And he was on the side of the Zulus in the Botha Rebellion more than he was on the side of the English. Nevertheless, because Indians were linked to the English in their legal role as British subjects, he had to deal with them. So there are many other examples of Gandhi dismissing, or rather participating in historical events while completely dismissing their aims or their logic. And I've just offered you 2 or 3 to show how you could actually be part of a major historical event while paying it no attention at all. And indeed, the First World War for Gandhi had almost no effect on his thought. The Second World War is a different story, but that is not part of my story here. So it's an interesting example of how the negative character of nonviolence and the refusal of history and its repudiation becomes possible even in the heart of historical violence. Now, while Gandhi tended to be quite transparent about what he did, he wrote interminably and spoke interminably about it, he was nevertheless accused of hypocrisy because his reasoning was not historical and was not public. That is to say, it didn't make sense in terms of the kinds of debates and arguments that formed public opinion or that circulated in any kind of public sphere. His views did not pose a dialectical alternative that was historical to some rival version of history, but were in fact evasive of history and of the historical event. And in this sense, you can perhaps call them esoteric, not because they were secret, but rather they were open secrets. That is to say, anyone who wanted to do so could grasp what Gandhi was trying to do and say. But you needed to be open to his thought in order to do so. Otherwise, like Churchill, you would call him a hypocrite, or as Churchill put it famously, the world's most famous humbug. Now, I use the term esotericism deliberately here. In the work of Leo Strauss, perhaps its most famous thinker in modern times, beyond mysticism, esotericism meant thinking outside the norms of the city without destroying them. But note that Gandhi doesn't quite behave in this manner. So for someone like Strauss, Socrates is a perfect example of someone who, despite himself, broke this rule. That is to say, he broke the norms of the city and therefore had to be punished. He wasn't esoteric enough. Whereas Gandhi, of course, who translated Plato's Apology, which is precisely about the death of Socrates, into Gujarati, saw Socrates as a model. Socrates was a model of sacrifice. So his vision of what I'm calling esotericism as an open secret was, unlike Strauss's, not about fear and protection. So for Strauss, the problem was, how do you guarantee personal integrity, intellectual integrity, and freedom of thought without being run over and destroyed and annihilated by established or public opinion? And how do you do so also in order to protect the very opinion, the city that is constituted by that opinion, from the dangers of your own thought? And esotericism was meant to create that kind of relationship of fear as well as protection. This is not, let me repeat, how someone like Gandhi thought about it. Now, if I am, talking about esotericism, I'm obviously not talking about it in its spiritualist or theological form, though someone like Khomeini does employ it. I think it's important not only because figures like Strauss, who was a very important thinker of the Cold War, made it a major category in political thinking in the second half of the 20th century, but also because esotericism became a really important part of Cold War political thought, a major political theme. Think, for instance, about Milosz, whose book, The Captive Mind, became an immediate and runaway bestseller when it was published at the height of the Cold War. Or Havel, who also wrote very much about the kind of secret life of intellectuals in Soviet, or as they often put it, totalitarian societies. Now, the thing about figures like Milosz and Havel is that they often dealt with what they call totalitarianism in a crude and sadly often racist way, because they Asiaticized totalitarianism, and Russia in particular, seen as being tyrannical and antagonistic to any notion of individual freedom because it was an Asiatic power. Indeed, when you look at Milosz and Havel and their books, they deal rather slightingly with Asian and African societies and politics, even of their own time. And I imagine that in part had to do with the eagerness to join the West, and Western Europe in particular, to be fully Europeanized. This is a desire that is well known to all those who study colonialism in many parts of the world. But the point here is that both figures like Milosz and Havel make a great deal of the hidden, the secret, the esoteric in mid-20th century political thought. Now, this is something that someone like Hannah Arendt also writes about in many of her works, not just the origins of totalitarianism, but also perhaps more interesting work on revolution, where she traces the destruction of esotericism, she doesn't use that term, to the French Revolution, where the French Revolution's desire to solve what she calls the social question entails, in her view, the ripping apart of the legal persona and the exposure of the inner life of the citizen, of the individual, to public authority, such that it is annihilated. So when you rip off the mask or the persona and get to the person underneath, you have destroyed the inner life and inner freedom of that person. And for her, this signals the origins of what would later become totalitarianism. Now, what's interesting about Miloš's vision of esotericism and his critique of it, because unlike Havel, who thinks that secret freedom is better than none at all, Miloš thought that it allowed Soviet intellectuals the luxury of pretending that they had somehow seen beyond or behind the brutality of Soviet rule and were free in their inner lives. But that simply allowed them to live with totalitarianism, as they called it, without really contesting it. So Miloš, in an example of the Asiatic reference that is often brought up by these Eastern European thinkers, gets his idea of esotericism precisely from Iran. And he does so through the work of Gobineau, a man often understood as being the founder of modern racism or racial science. And Gobineau, who spent a few years in Iran in the middle of the 19th century, wrote about the Shiite understanding of dissimulation, for which there are a number of terms, but he used the term ketman, which is also the term Miloš uses for it. And dissimulation is meant to be a way of preserving your inner integrity, inner freedom, and inner self from public opinion and the opinion of the city, as Strauss would put it, outside you. But when you actually look at Gobineau's work, he's saying something rather different. It is not a totalitarian society in which everything is already given in advance that inspires a kind of esoteric intellectual life. But rather, Gobineau writes in his book, Religions and Philosophies in Central Asia, a society marked by intellectual diversity and tolerance. That Gobineau suggests that Islam has, and Shiite Islam in particular, is too generic a religious form to have, if you will, what would later be called a totalitarian vision of life. It was too loose and amorphous. It allowed too much. It was not instrumental enough. And so dissimulation was important precisely because of diversity of opinion in the city. Precisely because there was an absence of a uniform orthodoxy. And yet the city's norms had to be respected nevertheless. So Ketman, Gobineau argued, is possible in a society where thought is not instrumental or warlike. He describes instrumental and warlike, in his words, thought indeed to Western Europe, but a society which tolerates contradiction, which he thinks of as being intellectually weak in some senses. So Ketman is also not a secret. It is an open secret. Everyone actually knows what the secret is. And dissimulation serves instead as a sign of respect for elevated ideas. I mean, this reminds me of what Gandhi, but also someone like Simone Weil, in her book on the abolition of all political parties, wrote about political parties in democratic dispensations. Because, of course, Gobineau's vision of Ketman seems to be much more like something that would occur in a democracy than in a totalitarian situation. So whether it was Gandhi in Hind Swaraj, his famous manifesto of 1909, or Weil in her book from the interwar period, wrote about how political parties in democracies depended upon rehearsed speech. They disallowed intellectual freedom at the individual level, and they disallowed integrity, therefore. The integrity, the mental and conceptual integrity of the individual, because they depended entirely upon rehearsed speech and familiar arguments that were relayed and repeated through the press. Whereas at the heart of democratic decision-making lay not speech, but secrecy, the secret ballot. That going to cast your vote has to be done absolutely in silence and invisibility, precisely so that the voter is not influenced by outsiders, by others. The voter can make her or his opinion on their own, make up their opinions on their own. But it is this silence, symbolized by the secret ballot, which has been completely ritualized in modern forms of parliamentary rule, according to both these thinkers. And democratic societies are therefore overrun by what I'm calling rehearsed speech, that you just need to sign on to an argument that a party has already made. In fact, party members are not allowed to dissent from any argument that the party has made. And it is in such a situation that esotericism becomes ever more important. So I would like to suggest, in other words, that the vogue for esotericism during the Cold War, of which I've given you, I hope, a reasonable number of examples, is characteristic not only, if at all, of so-called totalitarian societies, but even more so of democratic or parliamentary ones. And we have from Gandhi and Weil a kind of way of thinking about this and about the importance of silence and secrecy that goes back before the Cold War. Now, the only history of modern esotericism I know, which is not, again, a mystical, is by Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian, which, and it's his book, wonderful book called Critique and Crisis, which, like Gobineau, attributes its emergence, that is to say, the emergence of esotericism, precisely to the loss of the city's norms, not to a kind of totalitarian orthodoxy. And the loss of the city's norms, Koselleck argues, occurs with the wars of religion in early modern Europe. And it is those that gives rise to the politics of absolutism that is esoteric in a Machiavellian sense, that has to be removed from the mores and norms of society and conducted secretly, the arcana imperii. Koselleck goes on to argue that the Enlightenment's critique of this absolutist form of politics was also an esoteric enterprise. And he has a wonderful description in his book about how Enlightenment forms of critique meant to address this crisis emerge from Masonic lodges and places like that. They're secretive. But he argues they end up taking over the city itself with the philosophy of history precisely as their great narrative. So the Enlightenment is marked by the philosophy of history, which, as I began my lecture by saying, has to do with thinking about how the future is determined by the past and mediated through the present. Like Arendt, Koselleck seems to argue that with the success of the Enlightenment ends up destroying the secret, and therefore leads to totalitarianism because it destroys the inner life of the individual self. Yet neither Gandhi nor Khomeini, for instance, deployed esotericism either as part of the Arcana Imperii, Machiavellian esotericism in Koselleck's term, nor eventually to destroy the inner life. The former, as you have seen, dealt with it as an open secret. It was available to everyone. You just had to hear it or see it and know it, recognize it. Whereas the latter, Khomeini, maintained in a kind of a more mystical version of esotericism in a very anti-normative way. So, Khomeini does his normative politics, and then he writes poetry, which is entirely anti-normative and also in keeping with the Persian poetic tradition. But he's also able, through his understanding of esotericism, to make fundamental changes in the exoteric or the outward rules of Islamic governance. For instance, by explicitly arguing that scripture could be overruled by the interests of the Iranian nation. Now, in the post-Cold War situation, I want to suggest we belong more in a society like Gobineau's Iran, with multiple narratives and political norms that are increasingly enforced without legitimacy. And the absence of esotericism in our world, unlike in the Cold War world or in the world before the Cold War, as I've tried to describe it, our world doesn't seem to have this as part of its political thought. This absence is compensated for by its unmasking. Now, unmasking had been the term that Arendt, you will recall, used in her book on revolution to describe how the French revolutionaries, the terror, stripped away the persona of the subject or the citizen to eviscerate the inner life of every individual. But this is also a way of thinking that is famously true of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work on humanism and terror, where he writes about the Moscow show trials, the Stalinist show trials, and that of Bukharin in particular. That both with Merleau-Ponty and Arendt, the ideology of Stalinism required unmasking, that its very understanding of history meant that traitors had to exist. So even if they didn't exist, they had to be made to exist. So unmasking must occur. And I think we are in something like that situation today. Even though we don't have the esoteric dimension to our political thinking, we have plenty of unmasking, though it is nowhere near as interesting as the examples that Arendt or Merleau-Ponty describe. So rather than either a mystical realm, or as Strauss would put it, the art of writing to avoid persecution, esotericism can be understood as the evasion of historical narratives, or of dialectical ones, or of positive understandings of history. In the Gandhian sense, perhaps in Gobineau's sense, and in Simone Weil's sense, to say nothing of Sorel and Khomeini. So what I want to do now is end my lecture by looking at the failure of historical narratives in our own time to constitute a political imagination. Now, I already described the way in which identikit histories abound in our time, not only in history books, not only in political parties, but in social media and conversations. Very briefly, the Ukraine war. Both sides seem to agree on the Second World War and the Cold War for their genealogies. So the rival parties actually agree on their historical reference points. In the Gaza war, there's also a great deal of twinning that is occurring the Holocaust is twinned with the Nakba, the Aliyah with the return of Palestinian refugees, the Temple Mount with Al-Aqsa, the Jewish ghetto in Europe with the walled villages of the West Bank, the indigeneity of one people with the indigeneity of others, of the other, etc., etc., etc. This is all well known. The differences in historical narratives are perhaps more interesting, but also more problematic. We have on the Palestinian side, for instance, settler colonialism and apartheid. These are terms, of course, which have a particular reference to South Africa and South African history. But I'm reminded of Satadru Sen's essay on fascism without fascists, in which he actually distinguishes between apartheid in South Africa and what we mean by that term when deployed, say, on the West Bank. He notes that whereas in South Africa, apartheid depended upon the continuous presence and labor of Africans, it could not be conceived of without them. In far-right settler understandings of Israel, the Palestinians are not required at all. And if anything, they are meant to disappear. This is such Satadru Sen's one of the arguments he makes in that essay. And I think he's quite right. I don't want to make a big point about this, and he doesn't make a big point of it, but I mention it only so as to show how the historical reference points that we tend to use are, as they always are, inexact, because no two phenomena can be completely the same without being the same thing, but that perhaps we need to actually attend to their inexactness more closely. So these different narratives are nevertheless also offset by identification, so genocide in the history of both peoples. Many of these terms and categories are also deployed as legalistic and not oppositional and so political categories. In part, of course, as I mentioned just now, because so many of these terms are twins, they seem to be imitating each other, the opposition which politics requires is missing from them. But secondly, if they are legalistic, say South Africa's resort to the ICJ or the ICC, they also lack a certain kind of politics in another sense. Because the pronouncement of a court may discourage some people from arming or funding any side in this conflict, but it is unlikely to propose any political solution to that conflict, and it doesn't look like it's doing much deterrent work either. And of course, this is also because international law does not work in this manner. International conventions are like honor systems. You follow a convention because you hope and expect your enemy will do so as well. It is only when a state has been destroyed that a tribunal can be set up to impose penalties and judgments of the kind that are expected in domestic jurisdictions. Furthermore, there is very little attempt, as I suggested at the beginning of my lecture, to trace changes in many of these historical categories. Yet, Ukraine and Gaza, which are often contrasted, especially on the left, because Ukraine, of course, is meant to be the good war, and we should resist a Russian invasion and support Ukraine, but Gaza apparently is the reverse. Instead of seeing these as contrasted events, we might want to see them as actually belonging together, as they do belong together both in US politics and in funding. The funding for Gaza and the funding for Israel and the funding for Ukraine are often packaged together in Congress. Indeed, both conflicts may represent an effort to preserve America's global reach through proxy wars this time, rather than wars by its own army, in a situation where politics has now become regional. Rather than apartheid or settler colonialism, or perhaps in addition to them, the more recent precedent, I suspect, is probably the global war on terror and its failure, which also sought to remake the world in America's image. That, of course, was a negative war in the sense that it was premised upon a logic of exception. Everything that was done was meant to be exceptional in good sovereign fashion. But of course, it turned out to be instead constructive of a set of norms. And it is those norms that are in play today in the avoidance or the ignoring of red lines, in the flouting of international law, in preemptive attacks, etc., etc., etc. What is interesting about both these conflicts taken together rather than contrasted is the return of neutrality in both of them. In the Gaza war, neutrality is called ceasefire. In Ukraine, it's called neutrality. But in both cases, it has been the global South, as it is known these days, that has pioneered the return of neutrality and ceasefires. From a time, the war on terror, when they had been dismissed from international politics. And I think the return of neutrality signals the possible emergence of a new internationalism, which dispenses with polarity, whether unipolarity, bipolarity, or multipolarity, and is rather founded on, if you will, a kind of regionalism. For after all, today, the West itself has proven itself a purely regional construction. In these two wars, it has been, at least in terms of numbers of the UN, minoritized and shrunken into itself. And so we have a kind of challenge to, but also occupation of the old Cold War international order by the global South, even and especially in the turn to the ICC and the ICJ. It sometimes seems to me as if the turn to international courts is a way either to re-invoke them, to revivify them, or to demonstrate their utter failure and destruction. So there's something really ambiguous in that turn. In either case, we have the possible emergence of a new kind of internationalism. Now, the failure and protest of public opinion that I've been speaking about in our times probably begins with 2003, the invasion of Iraq, to 2024. In both cases, and between both these years, you have the most extraordinary public manifestations of protest against war, which were ignored by the countries that decided to prosecute these wars.
Satadru Sen Memorial.
And that has led, arguably, to the delegitimization of the politics of these countries, mostly Western countries, and consequently to the rise of what is called polarization and populism, which historical narratives are unable to comprehend except parochially. So when you think, for instance, about the United States and the way in which the attack on the Capitol after the elections that brought President Biden to power, the woefulness of the analysis is truly extraordinary to behold. We are told this is all about the Confederacy, race, and white nationalism, but when you actually look at the crowd in front of the Capitol, they are waving Iranian imperial flags in one or two cases, Indian flags. The leader of the Proud Boys was a Haitian immigrant. This is another America. This is not the America of black and white racial conflict. This is a new multicultural America in which people of many races belong to many different sides. There is something else going on here that the resort to the history of the Confederacy and the Civil War really doesn't allow us to get at. Those events might have some role to play in the genealogies of these events, but they really cannot define them. Now, I will end by saying that one reason why these historical narratives that we keep being offered are not credible any longer is because the historical narratives of the West can no longer define global history. And yet they cannot really be replaced by others either. There are no alternative histories that can cover global events. And so we are faced with a unique problem, which is the problem faced by people like Gandhi or Whale or Sorel, etc. Is there a way of thinking outside such narratives? Perhaps in the open secret of esotericism. This means either a mythical understanding of politics, the way, for instance, Gandhi referred to the Bhagavad Gita in trying to think about moral and political action, or which might be a more comfortable thing for people in this audience, a more philosophical understanding of politics. In either case, we might be in the situation, and I speak as a historian, of exiting the prose of history when thinking about politics in our own day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Faisal, for taking us on that extraordinary tour, which brought in Sorel, Gobineau, Simone Weil, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Mahatma Gandhi. And so I shan't attempt to summarize what you've said. I'm still digesting many of the streams of thinking that you brought in. But I think one of the things that struck me about the lecture was an attempt to think with that triad so central to human life of the past, present, and the future, and attempting to connect them in some way where the past can be a preface to the present and the future, or the past can be merely nightmare. The present can be the space of reflection or the space of despondency. And when you speak about Gaza, Ukraine, there were echoes of all of that. And the future remains in many senses outside our grasp, yet capable of determination. And that's where I think, the reference that you made to Benjamin very early on, where Benjamin talks about history as a kind of choice, right? Which is very similar, I think, to the way in which Gandhi also situated himself outside the flow of history, very much as Benjamin did. That what allows us access to the future is the attempt to reach back, as it were, at a moment of danger, urgently to a moment in the past that speaks to us. And that actually takes away from the trivialization that you spoke about, where people are called fascists, they are called communists. There's a kind of trivialization of history, but here there is a conscious choice where the question of the past becomes something that's a resource. Question of the past becomes something that's you revivify the past, just as much as there has been an appeal of late from South Africa to institutions which were seen in many senses as outmoded, right? Why go to the Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and so on? And it's really an attempt to actually reach back to a moment where an ethical intervention in the world was possible. So I found the talk extraordinarily erudite, but I also found it extraordinarily moving, because we all stand in the middle of a present where we feel we can do nothing, but I think we are afforded the multiple imaginations that you spoke about, right? That we are afforded the possibility of multiple narratives. And so thank you so much for this talk. I mean, I hope I can see the transcript of this so as to make better sense of it, possibly in the clear light of day. But thank you so much, Faisal. And the way we could do this perhaps is to have people put up their hand function. You know, you have something like that in Zoom, and then I can call upon you to ask questions. Yes, Igor has indicated a thumbs up sign. Yes, something like that, which uh, allows me to come to you for your questions. So we are open to questions right now because I think the chat function takes a while for people to actually write down things and for. Would anyone like to go first? Igor, yes. Would you like to open the innings? Yeah.
Thank you both, Faisal and Dilip. As Dilip said, you've got a whole world of thought there to digest in your talk. Rather than a question, I think at this point I can only make a comment. It seems to me that conscientious individuals seek all tools at their disposal to maintain a free life, whether it's an inner life or an outer life or both. And it's understandable that people reach for historical analogies, as in, look what may happen again if we don't behave better. I really do feel that we're living in a dark time of propaganda. The West, which parrots about democracy and freedom of speech and human rights, has shown itself to be deeply hypocritical. And I think depending on an individual's circumstances, they may choose to dissent in their inner life, or they may feel perhaps collectively that they can dissent in the open. But I'm deeply suspicious of the West's narrative, which it really wishes to convince us all as truth. I think that's enough from me. Thanks, Faisal.
Thank you. Igor, if you could mute yourself, and then perhaps you could take, Faisal, could I take one more question, comment? Marka had a hand up. Marka, would you like to? Oh, yes, thank you.
Hi, Faisal. Hello. So I want to thank you. I loved your talk and I was fascinated by it. And there's a lot I agree with and a lot I can learn from. And so it does a lot for me. I mean, like Dilip was saying, there's something very moving about it. And then at the same time, I'm listening to it right now. I'll try not to go on long. I'm just trying to say it concisely, but give me a couple minutes. So I'm listening to it while I'm in the midst of being very involved in like pro-Palestinian protests. And one part of those protests is the fight about history. And the vast gap between what it is that our societies within the West, Western Europe, where I'm coming from, Western Europe, the United States, right, what they know and say the massive forms of ignorance, and then the kinds of knowledge that are there in our universities, in our books, in our libraries, in our politics, everywhere. The knowledge is there, right? And the history is there. So this fight to have that history be, say, heard, to have it be deployed, to have it be legitimated is central, at least say where I'm coming from right now. And I understand, and I'm thinking about how to make what you're saying actionable, how to have it be the basis of praxis. And I think that's legitimate because a number of the people you talk about were people who were very, very interested in praxis. And so I was listening to Gideon Levy the other day, and he was asked by Chris Hedges, what do you see as the future? And he says, well, for him, what he sees right now is the annihilation of Native Americans, and that this is in fact sort of the future that is most present at the moment to him in terms of where it's going. If I listen to you, I think I might not, this is what I want you to clarify for me. I think you're saying we've got to get away from that way of approaching it so that we can imagine other futures.
Right.
But I feel like the urgency of the moment and the ignorance of the moment and the violence of the moment doesn't give us that option. So I'm in full agreement with everything you say, but I haven't got a clue how to make it actionable in a way that's going to be more effective than what we're doing now, which has limited effectiveness, but at least there's a discussion. At least people see the police brutalizing people, people protesting, and so forth. That's my question.
Thank you.
Thanks, thanks very much, Marka. Very nice to see you. Yeah, as a historian, I'm entirely sympathetic to historical analogies. And so it's, when I was putting together this talk, it was not particularly easy for me to do a kind of autocritique as a historian, but that's what I ended up doing. And I ended up doing it because it struck me that historical analogies and analyses are obviously important. I think like that. You think like that. But they may not be the only things that are possible when dealing with these kinds of subjects. And sometimes they might even be counterproductive in dealing with these subjects, especially in the world of social media and mass media, where you just bat arguments back and forth, and people adopt one or the other. And it's not clear where any of that takes us. So, I'm reminded of something Gandhi once said. He said, I don't need to know what actually happened to know what to do about it. I don't have to know who threw the first stone or what exactly happened in a particular place where a riot occurred in order to know how I might deal with it non-violently. And he was moving out of the historical mode of apperception and analysis into another one, and you could simply call it non-violent, or you could call it moral or ethical. And without dismissing the historical mode altogether, I just wonder if there are other ways of approaching such issues which do not end up in endless arguments about what actually happened. Mm-hmm. And this is also a way of thinking, therefore, slightly differently about the future. Because going back again to something I'd said about Gandhi in my talk, often the invocation of things like the extinction of native peoples, indigenous peoples in the Americas, it might be right, it might not be, but it creates a kind of telos that then sort of shuts down all other kinds of possibilities. And maybe that is the only possibility, but it would be a deeply pessimistic one. So, but to return to something Dilip said in his comments just now about Benjamin, I was thinking when I referenced him, of course, to Benjamin's idea that the new always comes dressed in the raiments of the past, that we are unable to think of the present, of the new, without linking it back to the past. And so one of my points in this lecture is just like, how can we actually think about the present anew? And can that only really be done by stripping it of its historical raiment? But Dilip, in mentioning redemption, which is, that is Benjamin's claim that our actions, the present, can actually redeem the past. Some moment in the past, which we thought of was a lost cause, we can redeem in the present or the future. So the past is a form of redemption, which I think is absolutely fascinating because it needn't even be historical. It can be entirely, if you will, mythical, not necessarily in Sorel's term, but if you think of either, I mentioned the Gita, but think also of the Greek myths, so which after all, in the period in which Gandhi was writing, allowed someone like Freud to put together an entire new discipline, right, through thinking mythically. And that psychoanalysis is, and I don't mean just the Greek myths. So it hadn't occurred to me, I hadn't thought of that particular version of Benjamin, but Dilip, you're quite right that redemption is a different way of thinking about the past, but it's not the past as a warning. It's not the past that we are going to see again. It's a past that actually that it doesn't rescue us, we rescue it.
Right.
We are doing something which has historical meaning in a redemptive sense. But that kind of conception goes well beyond assigning the assignation of blame or the drawing of historical analogies. It doesn't draw any analogies. It actually thinks about historical consequences in very non-teleological ways, because redemption is not about the logic of history that proceeds step by step in some kind of dialectic. It is something that we decide we need to do. So it really is creating a new future. And that is a way that of thinking about the past, which I find possibly far more productive.
Right. Okay, thanks, Faisal. Could I ask you something which actually proceeds from what Marka raised? I suppose it's also this question of what is to be done, the very Leninist idea. But at the same time, when you spoke about Gandhi and Gandhi's thoughts on the Gita, it's very much an Arjunian question, as it were. What is to be done? You're caught in a situation where the future is unknown. The present is fraught with indecision, right? And the present is also fraught with self-doubt. And in many senses, the course of action that is prescribed at that point is that of a clarity that arrives from the necessity for action regardless of prior ethical concerns, right? And I wonder what you think about the recourse that not only Gandhi, but many other early nationalists had to the Gita. I mean, that the Gita seemed to offer a certain relation to the past, present, and future. And I just wondered whether you had something to say on that. And then there's one more question in the chat box, which we can return to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose because the Gita offered an entire philosophy of action, that it became so important from the 19th century in a different way than it had been important in the past. And, perhaps it wasn't so much the idea of karma as a trans-historical force that begins before you're born and survives well after you're gone, but rather, certainly I think in Gandhi's view, the idea of acting not in the usual, by asking the usual question that is posed in Ethics 101 classes, how would you choose?
Right.
Because Arjuna in the Gita doesn't, in Gandhi's view, have a choice. He has been brought there by a series of actions, including his own, to this battlefield. Whether he leaves or he stays, the war will occur and people will die. Right. He needs to, he needs to fight this war. That's why he's there. So in a way, it's an ethics of choicelessness. It's not it's not a market ethics of the lesser and the greater. It's, you need to figure out who you are, how you are placed in your world, in your society, and therefore what your duty is. And, I find that very, very interesting, because even though I said in my lecture that Gandhi argued that by behaving nonviolently in the present, you are opening up the future to more and more possibilities, virtuous possibilities. Here, he argues, it's not a contradiction because he's looking at a different thing altogether. He argues that action is a necessity,
Right.
and it's not a choice. And once you know what your action should be, you perform it. And I think that was the kind of thing that was so important for Indian thinkers from the mid to late 19th century into the 20th century. That it was not the metaphysical parts of the Gita, if you will, but this kind of thing that really spoke to them.
Yeah, thanks, Faisal. There's a question here from Kanha Prasad. I'd requested them to ask the question themselves, but are you able to read it, or shall I read it out to you?
I have, yeah. Would you reconcile Gandhi's focus on the absence of history certainty as a precondition for politics with his prioritization of truth alongside nonviolence as a central principle of his politics? What kind of certainty or absence did his idea of truth involve? That's an excellent question, because, of course, Satya is an absolutely crucial category for Gandhi. But again, it was not something that was given, I think, to him. So he says over and over again, not least in his autobiography, that he's in search of truth, and that truth can only become available non-violently. Because violence, whether if thought or emotion or actual physical violence, can only cloud understanding and judgment and be partisan. So truth is something that is only available through nonviolence. But it is not something that he claims to have found necessarily.
Right.
So it is something that is always at some kind of remove. Though, like Sorel's general strike as a myth, it informs all his actions, his desire for it, and his certainty about it, though he doesn't see it there in front of him. So, whether truth is a regulative kind of idea for Gandhi that allows for nonviolent action, or it's something else, it's not entirely clear. But I think for him, truth is also, it's not an object, it's a subject in its own right. So in that sense, it's not a negative term like nonviolence. So if you look at the Gujarati title of his book, the story of my experiments with truth, it's actually not in which truth is the object. In English, it's Satyana Prayogo. It is the prayoga, the activity, the experimentation or whatever of Satya. Satya is the subject, or could be read as the subject. So it is not Gandhi who's in search of the truth in some ways. It is the truth that is the subject of Gandhi's autobiography. It is not him. And the truth works like this through nonviolence. So you're right. Unlike nonviolence, it is not a negative category. It is a positive one, but it's not, if you will, it is, again, to use the Derridian term, it is not necessarily part of a metaphysics of presence. It's not there, though it actually runs the show in some senses. So I'm sure there's much more that can be said, but I would have to give it more thought, but only to repeat that when you think about truth as the subject of action, then you really are in a karmic world as well, because it is precisely before you are born and after you die that what survives and actually does the acting is truth.
We have one more question. Thanks from Noyonika Mukherjee. Noyonika, would you like to reveal yourself and ask the question? Yeah, there we go.
Sure. Hi, Faisal. Great to hear you virtually, and I'm glad we could all hear this lecture virtually. We were not in South Africa, so thanks, Dilip. This is a fantastic lecture, so thank you for that. Really helped me thinking through a lot of things, and not things that are along with Gaza, Ukraine, and I'm also thinking of something which does not matter to many people in the world that much, but it matters to me a lot. I'm thinking a lot with Bangladesh and what's been happening, and many of the things. And I've just been in Bangladesh in August, and just thinking through the various forms of, kind of the lack of truth, or people, many of my friends, or people not knowing what is actually truth and what is not. So just thinking through many of these frameworks you have for us, whether the idea of redemption, or would that stand in for forgiveness? Because that non-forgiveness is something that I'm thinking through a lot, or irreconciliation. And within your own examples, I'm just thinking of what kind of historical narrative would or what kind of esotericism would work for you in terms of evading a historical narrative. What do you see, say, whether if you want to take up a empirical instance, even of Gaza or Ukraine, what's the future to be? So it's or how do we open up the future to all these possibilities? So it's been really the reason I came out. I thought your abstract really talked to some of the things I was thinking about, and I know you've written a little bit about Bangladesh in the past, so I'm sure you might be thinking about it. But I know it's geopolitically not so important to most people. But at the same time, I also feel that Bangladesh is all about geopolitics. So would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, thanks, Naka. Very nice to see you. We must meet in person again soon.
Yes.
And, I mean, when I was constructing this lecture, and there is no text, by the way, Dilip, I'm sorry to say, I spoke from a set of notes.
There will be.
Yeah. So, I asked myself this question as well, so how could I come up with it as, if you will, an open secret or an esoteric way of thinking about politics? I don't know if I can. So in one sense, my lecture really is a historical, though it's anti-historical in tone. It is a history of the modern thinking of esotericism. Whether we can actually do that, or whether I can actually do that, I can imagine one or two ways, which would not necessarily be esoteric so much. And that is a kind of philosophical reading of politics, but which speaks directly to contemporary events, which, I don't mean normative philosophical understanding. Whether it's in very popular registers, say through the Gita or the Mahabharata, in thinking about what happens, because these are forms, these are texts that, in my view, disallow the kind of historical identification that Gandhi was so critical of in historical narrative, where you identify fully with someone in the past or some event in the past, that, it's not so easily done in the mythological or the mythical register. It can be done. You can always identify someone as Ravan, but, it's not historicized in the same way, and because it's not about repeating something that happened in the past. It's not part of a telos in this fashion. But what I did try to do a bit at the end of my talk was to suggest how both the historical narratives that we do use, say for Ukraine and Gaza, are actually strangely twinned, that rather than opposing each other, which they ostensibly do, they imitate each other. And so they kind of collapse under their own weight in some sense. But also, I tried very briefly to see how I might read these events, like Ukraine and Gaza, slightly differently, not in any particularly innovative way. So I suggested, for instance, that if we were to take the war on terror as our precedent, in a good historical sense, then we would understand them a bit differently than we do today. And one reason why we don't take the war on terror as one of our precedents is because I think it doesn't count as part of the history of Western victory, like the Cold War and the Second World War and fascism and communism and all the rest. So even though it might be the more apposite reference point, it is rarely made. And when it's made for rather different reasons. You will remember the White House in the earlier days of the Gaza war used to make this kind of comparison. Don't do what we did during the war on terror. You don't want an open-ended war. So it's a rather different employment of that, that particular precedent. So what I have ended up with in my talk, at the end of my talk, was nothing more than other historical narratives rather than a non-historical one. Though I wonder if it is possible. I suspect it is. I'm not the one to do it, perhaps, but I suspect it is possible to try to think in a quite different register about these contemporary events. And that does not in order to simply cast aside all the historical narratives, but really to offer another kind of way into them. And therefore another kind of argument that is to be had. And that could be about nonviolence, it could be about philosophy, as I suggested. Bangladesh, is, I don't think it's a minor thing at all. It's a really major thing, and not just for South Asia, that has happened and is happening there. And you will know, Monica, much more than I do about it. But as you know, the small thing that I did write about Bangladesh had to do precisely with how it actually, its founding, and I used your work for it among others, how its founding departs from the so I'd written this little essay in EPW about how Bangladesh, in a way, the founding of Bangladesh signals the end of the post-colonial moment, which had begun certainly in South Asia and globally in 1947, because it was founded not as part of an anti-colonial movement against the colonial state, and its history of freedom doesn't have very much to do with colonialism, though of course everyone knows that it existed. But it was founded against a post-colonial state, Pakistan, through a civil war and a revolutionary war. And that therefore it stands at an angle from its neighbors, India and Pakistan, though in every other way it shares their history. It has a quite different national history. If anything, if it marks the closing of the post-colonial period, it marks the beginning of a new period in which new states come into being more and more through the destruction of post-colonial states and through civil wars, whether there are proxy wars and outside powers involved or not. And interestingly, in India, certainly today, we find a very similar debate about Bangladesh, where, it's all the Americans who are meant to have fomented this, supposedly color revolution, and imposed Muhammad Yunus on the country, and et cetera, et cetera. Whether this makes sense or not, it seems to make very little sense to me. But it seems, this appears to be the kind of the popular narrative in India on all sides. But correct me if I'm wrong. So, but what has happened there, of course, is very interesting, and you can read it as you can also look at it more closely as what are the students doing? What is the army doing? And you, Nanika, you'll know much more than I do about this. Are we in a situation where you have the army stepping in, like in Egypt after the Arab Spring, where the new government or the civilians are meant to have proven themselves irresponsible, and then the army steps in and takes over. So we have seen this story before. In either case, it's a global story, which is why I mentioned Egypt. It's not simply a Bangladeshi or a South Asian story. But that doesn't really get to your question about how can you think it completely differently. Though my own attempt to do so by dividing Bangladesh in some ways, not in others, from India and Pakistan's national histories, is true. It really opens up a new historical trajectory. It is a global actor in that sense. And if you look at it in those terms, then we have a different kind of vision of its past and of its future. But again, there's no open secret here, I'm afraid. I mention it and I describe it, but I don't know if I'm capable of actually offering one up of my own.
Thanks, Faisal. And we are probably coming to the end of our Zoom allocation, as it were, at which point we shall be brutally cut off. But there's one last question by from Shoyali. I hope I'm getting the name correct. Do you have her in your chat box? Them in your chat box?
Yes, but yes, okay. I'll read it out. In the context of India, this connects to my ideas about right-wing Hindutva politics. For quite a while, I have believed that the politics of the right wing in India today is being developed on culture instead of a hegemonic ideology or coherent history. So the right is doing this already in their own way. This kind of politics is further emboldened by lack of clarity of post-colonial liberal politics in India. Your thoughts? Writing my question as I'm at the library. Well, very nice to hear from you, Sohaili. I haven't been in touch in a while. Sohaili was a student at Oxford. I agree. What's interesting about Hindutva is that it's so protean. It doesn't require what the Congress Party required, the collected works of Gandhi and Nehru and all, which are to be studied. And, there's a whole historical enterprise there. Okay. They don't necessarily read their own thinkers, if you can describe them as such. We have to read them. I read Savarkar and Golwalkar and all the rest, but, your regular Hindutva people don't necessarily. I would find it, and they're not easily available either. There are no collected works. They could easily have been on the Congress model, since we have had BJP rule for quite some time now, a whole establishment created. But it's not being done precisely because, it really has become a kind of mass and social media kind of movement and a WhatsApp movement where all you require is a meme, which then travels and can be, as it were, actioned anywhere in the country in different ways. And then some of those actions beget imitations in other places. It's not like there's no planning, but it doesn't require lots of reading and study and understanding of the historical past. The historical past, as relayed in a lot of Hindutva polemics, is it doesn't even necessarily draw on, as I was saying, past Hindu nationalist writers. And that, I think, is one of the reasons for its dynamism, because it really is embedded in the social. It's not even really established in the state as much. The state depends upon this constant social upheaval, which is encouraged, but which is not sort of necessarily just directed from the top. So I quite agree that it's not the kind of history I was talking about, and yet it is entirely historical, nevertheless, in its references. Whether it's the Babri Masjid, whether it is, and all of it is out and out historical. 1,000 years of conquest, it might be good history, it might be bad history, but it's historical. So I agree with you in one sense. We are not talking about any kind of complex historical narratives, but we are talking about a way of thinking that remains deeply, deeply historical. Because, as Gandhi might suggest, that is how identification works. It works through notions of historical grievance and vengeance. And to have grievance and vengeance, you have to have history. You can't not have it. So in that sense, it is all about history.
Thanks a lot, Faisal. I think we should now round up. Ma, would you have something to say or ask?
Just to thank Faisal and you for arranging this very stimulating lecture. And I really appreciate the participation that followed the lecture. So I'm just glad that we could have this, that we could bring the minds together.
And
I tend to think that non-action is as much an action as action is.
But
and we are never without a choice.
Right.
Limited, but we always have a choice. Okay, that's all.
And thank you for that. And I think the thing is also, I mean, action in the case of organizing the Satadru Sen Memorial lecture is more necessary than non-action. And I'm glad that you've made this possible. And there was a way in which I think Noyaneka's question kind of spoke to something in your lecture, which I'd like to end with, where you spoke about Ayatollah Khomeini and the idea of the faith and the trust in the unseen, which becoming the spur for action where you are beyond eschatology and you're beyond teleology. And there is a need to act in the present, which we saw in Bangladesh. I mean, which was really that. There was that collective faith in the unseen, which led to the kind of consequences, despite allegations of conspiracy theory, etc. But thank you, Faisal, for that extraordinary lecture. And I really do hope that you will write it up and we shall see it in print. And thank you all for being here, those of you who have stuck it out to the very end. And we had around 40 people to begin with, and we are only down to 20, which is not bad. So good night all, and thank you so much for being with us. And thank you again, Faisal.